Hello, everyone. I'm Melory Johnson, 26-year beauty veteran, advisor, and fractional COS. Welcome back to Pretty Equity, where we tackle the real issues facing beauty founders and investors and bring you the answers from the experts behind the deals. In episode 4, Matt Bestercy walked us through the contract manufacturer from the quality auditor seat, what good GMP looks like inside the facility, the water system as a diagnostic, the FDA enforcement chain, and the proactive versus reactive culture frame. That episode answered the question, how do you know if a CM is operating to standard? Today's episode is the second half of that conversation. Same problem, the CM relationship, but a completely different seat at the table. Today, we're talking to the operator who works with the CM every day on behalf of the brand. That person is the product development and supply chain seat. That seat sees the daily texture of the relationship, what's working, what's drifting, and what's about to break long before anyone says the word delay. If you haven't watched episode 4 with Matt Bestercy, the GMP episode, I'd highly recommend going back there, then coming back here, because today we're going to assume that foundation and use this time to go deeper into what that episode did not cover. We're going to talk about choosing the right partner, about whether you can actually scale with them, about the warning signs that that partnership is starting to break, and about the operational patterns that kill launches, the things that happen again and again that founders almost never see coming. So our guest is Miriam Mandel. Miriam is a fractional head of product development and supply chain with 20 plus years of experience inside beauty development and manufacturing with IBG. And Miriam, please just correct me if I'm wrong at any point here, but IBG, which is one of North America's larger manufacturers, and more recently leading product development at Inkbox through its acquisition by BIC. Her current practice is built around helping brands get launches unstuck. And you know what I'm talking about. The formula is approved, the packaging is selected, and everyone is busy. But something is off, and no one can quite name what that is, which is exactly the seat I want you guys to hear from today. So without further ado, Miriam, welcome to Pretty Equity.
Thanks, Melory. It's so great to be here. And yeah, I second, highly recommend watching Matt's interview. It's a great introduction to what you're looking for in a CM from a technical perspective.
Thank you. Yes, I know Matt is a genius at what he does. Anyway, Miriam, I want to start with you. Okay, so let's start by establishing what you see from your seat. Okay, the PDSC seat. Because most founders deal with their CM through invoices and timelines, right? But from where you're sitting, you see something completely different. So walk us through what you actually do. What does the product development and supply chain seat look like inside a beauty brand? And what do you see at the CM that founders don't?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm really lucky to work with a lot of great founders. And what I see most often when I first come in is that the founder is managing product development, but they're also managing sales, marketing, ops. And it's tough to have the bandwidth to see when those product development details are slipping or when something is sort of going on with your contract manufacturer that you need to pay attention to. When I was with Orchard, also known as IBG, as you said, I was directing product development across over 30 customers at the same time over many years. So you start to see patterns really quickly across those relationships, what works, what doesn't work, where things are consistently breaking down. There's definitely patterns there. And that's the experience that I bring to the brands that I work with. And as the
Mm-hmm.
PD lead, I guess the difference is you're really sitting at the intersection of formulation, packaging, manufacturing, and the timeline all at once. So when you're focused at that intersection, you really see when those tracks are out of sync before you've got a big problem.
Absolutely. And we're gonna really get into that a little later. But your tagline is that you get beauty launches unstuck, right? Brands come to you when something's off, but they can't quite put their finger on it. And but from your point of view, Where are launches actually breaking down? Is it in, I don't know, formulation, packaging? Is it the CM relationship? Is it in documentation? Because that's a big one. Or I don't know, is it founder side coordination? Where's the disconnect?
I think when launches first start to break down, there's a perception that there's going to be this one catastrophic failure, and you're going to find this one thing that's going to solve the problem. But what I see most often is a series of decisions that are either being made not in the right order, being made late, not being made at all. And that series of missed decisions compounds into big problems down the road. So I
Mm.
think the first common pattern I see is, yeah, the decision order is being made wrong. Maybe the formula development started before the packaging was selected, or vice versa. The packaging was locked in before the formula is ready. And it's really key that those two tracks run together from the beginning. The formula needs to be developed for its actual packaging. When that doesn't happen, you're already off track, and it's likely there's something that's going to have to be fixed down the road.
Mm.
The second problem that I see a lot actually is timelines without buffers. A lot of timelines I see, every step is assumed to start the moment the previous one ends, right? So the formula is approved, the next day they've got compatibility starting, and that timeline is built with no buffers into it. So you see sort of everything happening sequentially really quickly without leaving room for preparation. And that's not how it works in real life. Once you approve a formula, a compatibility batch has to be made. It has to be scheduled. Raw materials need to be brought in. There needs to be lab time set aside for that. So nothing moves instantly. And without those buffers, it's really easy for the timeline to slip. And I
Mm.
think those are sort of the two patterns I see that compound into the biggest problems down the road.
Mm, mm. And we're going to talk more about patterns a little later. But the point that this compounds is kind of like playing dominoes. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Like once that thing starts to fall, they're all going to fall because like you say, it's
Absolutely.
sequential.
Hmm.
But just talking about what founders miss here for a second, from your experience, what is the most common thing founders don't realize that they're responsible for once they're working with the CM? Where does the founder's job actually start, and where does the CM's job start? Because as I'm always saying, you can't outsource responsibility.
You're absolutely right. And at the end of the day, as the brand, you are responsible. The responsibility stops and ends with you. And I see a lot of founders that don't know what they're responsible for. I think the biggest one is testing, compatibility testing, stability testing. Founders often assume that their contract manufacturer is handling all that. The contract manufacturer is assuming that the brand knows that it's their responsibility. So you see a lot of things fall through the cracks. It's not caught until down the road that testing hasn't been done. A second one that I see a lot and can open you up to a lot of liability is regulatory. A lot of brands are assuming that their CM or their formulator is reviewing every ingredient and percentage for global compliance, or that their claims that they've already sort of approved these claims from a regulatory perspective. And if you ever want to sell outside of the US into Europe and UK, into Southeast Asia, into Latin America, you really need to start collecting your documentation throughout development and make sure that you're gathering your safety data, your ingredient information, your supplier documentation. And it's a really good idea to get your own third-party regulatory person just to make sure that you're on track and that you're set up for selling in global markets.
Before we start getting into more of the mechanics, I want to talk about evaluating a CM. I want to ask a question that I find almost no founder asks upfront. And and that is who exactly is going to be on the other side of this relationship between the brand and the CM? Because a real scaling CM relationship, a successful scaling CM relationship doesn't just run through one account manager. You know what I mean? There are other people you're going to be dealing with. They're teams. Obviously there's sales, R&D, but there's also quality, as you said, regulatory. You've got engineering, project management, supply chain, of course, customer service. All of these teams at some point or another should be in front of a founder, right? But walk us through what teams the founder should expect to interact with at the CM, and what order should they be expecting to gauge with these people? Because I've seen, and to me this is a red flag, and you can respond to this, but for example, at CMs where they have no project management, right?
Mm.
They have no project management team. It becomes massively problematic. And I've seen huge breakdowns because how does the project then move from the lab into production if there's no project management team? And that's just an example. But anyway, that was my question if you want to just
Yeah,
react to
I
that.
mean, and that's a great example. It can be really intimidating to start vetting a new CM, and I think a lot of founders don't know where to start. Where I usually start is asking a few key questions that will tell me whether the CM is the right fit for the brand and the size that they are at now, and probably the size that they're going to be in about 2 years. So I usually ask first about the size of the facility, how many employees work there, how many chemists are on the R&D team. That just gives you an indication of the size of the facility. And it's ticking boxes, but you're also just trying to figure out if it's the right size for you, if they have the right infrastructure there. I definitely like to know how many chemists there are so I can get an indication of how long it may take them to formulate or to prepare a sample. I really want to know whether they have a dedicated QA and QC lead. That's really important. I really want to know if they have any regulatory personnel and packaging engineers, as you said. And it just really tells you if this is going to be the right partner for you as you scale, and they can kind of scale with you. It's also really good to be knowing who you're dealing with day to day. You mentioned project manager. Usually, the first person you're interacting with at a new CM is a salesperson, and the salesperson's job is to get your business. So, they're going to tell you what you want to hear. They're probably really charismatic and probably very responsive. But your point about a project manager is a great one. I would ask if you can meet that project manager, if you can meet who's going to be your day-to-day contact, who's going to be tracking the tasks, who's going to be watching your timelines. Is there someone there that you can touch base with weekly or whatever cadence works for you and is going to help make sure that decisions are made when they need to be made? I think looking for a project manager or a person you're going to be in touch with regularly is something you can ask up front before you decide to move ahead with a contract manufacturer.
Mm. No, and when it comes to that, and I brought that one up in particular because what I found is the biggest issue comes when there's no communication, right? And I don't mean necessarily that you're ghosted, but what I mean is that the communication is slow, or you're getting information way too far along, so by the time you realize, hey, we could have sorted this out, do you know what I'm saying? Now the problem
It's too
has
late.
grown, right? And that's just because there isn't anyone there to be talking to. Like you said, you can't always talk to the salespeople. The salespeople, yes, may be the ones who are the most communicative, but they're the ones that honestly you're going to need the least. You know what I mean? The people working on your project are the ones that you should be talking to, you know what I mean, on a
Absolutely.
not even, weekly basis. As you need to, they should be available.
Exactly. The salesperson's job is to initiate the relationship, and then they're moving on looking for, the next brands to bring in. You just want to make sure there's a great infrastructure that's going to support you all throughout your brand journey.
Hmm. Now, before we move on, I want to plant a seed here that we'll come back to at the end of our conversation.
Okay.
Across 20 years inside this industry, what is the good in terms of the good, the bad, and the ugly? What is the good you see in the CM partnerships that work? And what's the ugly that keeps showing up, in those relationships that don't work?
I would say the early good is really clarity and transparency. You want to know from the beginning who owns what, who owns the formula. Get everything in writing. You want to know up front what the brand is responsible versus what the contract manufacturer is responsible. I talk a lot about vendor partnerships, and I think the brand that gets the most out of the relationship with their contract manufacturer is understanding that it's a two-way street. You also need to have that clarity. Be close to your formula, show up as a good partner, and then you'll continue to build a great relationship with your contract manufacturer. What you need to watch out for, and this is the ugly, is ambiguity, right? If you're not discussing formula IP, if your contract manager isn't bringing up, if your contract manufacturer isn't bringing up what they're responsible versus what you're responsible for, if testing responsibility is never discussed, if you're not receiving documentation, those things can feel like small oversights, but that ambiguity builds, and those can lead to really expensive problems down the road. And I
Mm,
would say that one other sort of ugly thing I see is when brands go into that relationship with their CM really adversarial, really squeezing them hard on price, treating them like just any other vendor, and not really like investing in that relationship. Um, it's a partnership. And I would definitely keep that in mind that you're sort of growing together, you're going to solve problems together. And if you don't, you'll probably get deprioritized pretty quickly by your contract manufacturer.
yeah. No, no, look, I mean, it's a two-way street,
It's a two-way
exactly
street.
like you said. It's a partnership. Okay, so now we know, like what you see, where launches break, where the founder responsibility line actually sits, right? Who should be in the building insofar as the teams that we just spoke about, and the early signals you read in partnerships. Now I want to go to the foundational decisions a founder makes about who they manufacture with. So back in episode 4, when I sat down with an auditor, with Matt Bestercy. We walked through choosing a CM from the quality auditor's point of view. What you look for in the facility, the systems, the FDA enforcement architecture, all that kind of stuff. This part of the conversation is the other half, the product development and supply chain point of view. But before we go to my next questions, I want to do a very quick clarification, particularly for our non-US audience, because the terminology around manufacturing partners has gotten a little muddy. So there are 3 terms that get thrown around: CM, CDMO, CMO, and people get very confused as to what they mean and if they actually even have a meaning, right? So initially, in the very beginning, your CM was strictly a contract manufacturer, a third-party facility that literally produces your brand's products. The CDMO, on the other hand, which is your contract development and manufacturing organization, was a CM, yes, but they also offered additional services, and that was in-house R&D. So you could go to them, for example, for white label product, right?
Right.
CMO, which sometimes gets thrown around, was just used interchangeably between the two. It didn't really have a term, a definition per se. The reason I'm bringing it up is because in North America specifically, the line is blurred almost completely. And so now there are CMs that also offer formulation, and there are CDMOs that just do straight contract manufacturing. So, for confusion's sake, just know that the label matters less than what each specific partner is offering you. And that's the part, Miriam, where I now want to kind of like dive into that a bit. Selection, you know what I mean? How do you select your service provider from your perspective? And and again, the reason I want to hear from your perspective is because from Matt's vantage point as an auditor, he was looking for so totally different things when he was
Right.
choosing, you know what I mean, a facility, compared to the choices that you would make. So, when you're walking the floor, or when you're looking at your list of choices for contract manufacturers, and you're with your founder, what are you guys looking at? What are you evaluating? What are you asking?
Yeah, well, first, I definitely agree with you. I think in Europe and Asia, that distinction between CMO and CDMO is sometimes more meaningful than it is in North America. And I find here, yes, that those labels are sort of blurred here. What I'm really looking for is fit, what their capabilities are, whether this partner can make the specific product well that you want them to make, and whether they can grow with you. So know that a lot of manufacturers specialize in particular areas. You're not going to bring a cosmetic powder to a CM that specializes in skincare. So make sure that the chemist that you're working with and the CM that you're working with actually makes the specific product that you want to make. and that they're going to be able to grow with you as you scale. So you're looking for a partner that's collaborative, that's flexible, and that's the right size for where you are now and probably where you want to be in 2 years. I do see a lot of founders walk a large CM that is flexible on their minimum order quantity and has amazing equipment and a massive facility and makes really big promises. But it may not necessarily be the right partner for you. If you're still small, you'll find that you may be a low priority client to them, and it will be hard to get their attention. It may be, take longer to get samples, take longer for someone to get back to you. But it's really about finding the right fit and ask them about their current capacity. How full is their production schedule? If you're talking to a lab and they're running at 100% capacity, it may be challenging them for them to take you on. If they're running at 20% capacity, that's probably pretty concerning as well. So you just really want to make sure they have a good understanding of the kind of product that you want to make, and you can always ask for brand references. You can ask to speak to customers that they currently work with and find out about their experience. This is a really important decision, so you want to have a lot of information up front.
So let's move on to white label and market
Yeah.
ready formulas, because in the beginning I did differentiate between what was a CM and a CDMO, right? So let's just use those terms correctly now and say you've chosen to go with a CDMO, and because you're looking for white label or market
Yeah.
ready formulas. Okay, so your CDMO has the stock formula, right? Sits there on their shelf. They send you a sample, you like it, you buy it, maybe you tweak the fragrance, I don't know. You put your name on it, you launch, right? Fine, terrific. It sounds awesome on paper. It's fast, it's cheap, seems like it's low risk, but in practice, though, it isn't always what it seems. So Miriam, walk us through the reality. When does white label actually work and when does it backfire? And what should founders understand about that choice before they make it? Because bearing in mind, under MOCRA, and we can talk a bit about that in a bit too, the brand owner is responsible for everything. You are the responsible party. And when something goes wrong, it's on you. It's not on the contract manufacturer.
White label can be a little bit controversial. There's lots of opinions about it, but I definitely think there's specific situations where white label can make sense. If you're trying to get to market really quickly, if you want to test a concept on a smaller scale, or some people are just in a category where formula differentiation doesn't matter as much as brand differentiation, it can make sense. There are facilities out there and labs out there that have great stock formulas that already have all the testing done and are ready to go to market. I think you just really need to understand what the trade-offs are when you choose to go with a white label program. The first is IP. You're not going to own this formula. This formula's IP belongs to the contract manufacturer who developed the formula and who produces it for you. And the second one is really differentiation. You have to understand that the same stock formula could be in the same market you're selling in from other brands who are also using a white label program. And, as you said, because you're going with white label, it doesn't exempt you with any responsibility. It's not a way to relieve yourself of responsibility under MOCRA. Under MOCRA, the brand owner is the responsible party, regardless of who formulated the product and who's producing it. So you still need to get all your safety substantiation files, your stability data, your challenge test results. So I think for some people, in some cases, white label can work for a brand. You just really need to understand those trade-offs.
Mm. And I think to your point, when it comes to MOCRA and responsibility, the idea that, oh, we're going to go with white label because now we don't have to do all the other extra things. Yeah, sure. It might be ready to go to market in terms of stability testing, maybe some HRIPT, PET testing, the preservative efficacy. But you're still responsible for that, the PIF. You're still responsible for that safety dossier. You're still responsible for knowing who the raw material suppliers were. You know what I mean? All
Exactly.
that
So
comes down to you.
yeah. Yeah. So if you do choose to go that route, before you get in too deep, make sure that the contract manufacturer is going to be able to supply you with all that documentation so you're not getting a nasty surprise down the road.
Yeah, right, right. Okay, so let's pivot here and talk about R&D because we kind of touched on it a little earlier. But I want to talk about capability specifically,
Mm.
because this is where some of the most consequential evaluation work happens and where it almost never gets done well by founders. Okay, so here's what I mean. When you're looking at a manufacturing partner's R&D function, okay, you're actually addressing the chemist team, right? The experience with that particular product category. And you alluded to all of this a little earlier. Are they color chemists, for example, or should you be looking for color chemists? Because, you know what I mean, that is a pretty difficult category. What does the inside of their lab look like? Again, going back to color, there may be instrumentation that would be required for certain tests on color that they may not have in their lab. So even though they say, sure, we can do it for you, maybe that's not the answer. And for me, a CM with a weak or an under-resourced R&D function is a very different proposition from one with a deep bench. So, I just want you to react to that because you did bring, R&D in the lab into our conversation a little earlier.
Yeah, go see the lab. I think it's important to go visit your contract manufacturer. Go take a look at the lab. Is it clean? Do they have great equipment? How many chemists are there? If you can't get there in person, I want to know who the chemists are and what are the experiences they have with the specific product that you want to deliver. Some labs will have chemists that specialize in emulsions, and chemists that specialize in powders, and chemists that specialize in different areas. Get a good understanding of who's in the lab, how many senior chemists and how many junior chemists, and understand the experience that they have with different products. That category experience really matters enormously. And knowing the size of the team also lets you know how long you can expect before you can see samples or how long revisions are going to take. If there's only one chemist, that's really going to slow you down.
I know,
And
good
you
luck with
also
that, right?
good luck with that. It's going to take you 6 months to see something out of the lab, and know that typically you're going to have revisions, right? You're going to go back and you're going to want to see one or two or three revisions until you've approved your formula.
Mm.
And you want to understand the development process. Is the chemist involved in the scale up, right? Are they going to be overseeing pilot batches and line trials as a standard part of their scale up? And I think scale up is a whole other conversation that we'll get into. But
Yeah,
yeah,
we're gonna get into scale
we'll
up in a
get there.
bit
We'll get
too.
there.
So
Yeah.
don't worry about it. That's not off the
Okay.
hook. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So let's continue our conversation, our R&D conversation. But I want to talk now about tech transfers.
Tech transfers. Yeah.
Because tech transfer is in many ways the ultimate test of a CM's R&D capability. It's that one thing that exposes whether the chemist team and the lab can actually do the work or whether they just say they can. So, Miriam, walk us through what tech transfer actually involves. Why does a brand choose a tech transfer over starting fresh with a new CMO? And when you're trying to tell whether a CM can genuinely execute one, versus, the CM who just says they can just to get the business, what do you ask and is there a way to stress test their answer?
There is. I think tech transfers are a higher risk and a little bit more complex than most people think. Um, And I think you do need to stress test your manufacturer, because I've also heard contract manufacturers say that tech transfers are quite easy. You give us your formula and we're going to be able to execute it. But there's a lot you need to understand about it. The reason why brands are running tech transfers, I mean, it's mostly continuity. They've invested in a formula with a chemist. Maybe they've approved that formula and it hasn't been manufactured yet. They're looking for the right partner. Or maybe they're switching CMs and this is a product that's already in the market. You don't want to rebuild from scratch. But to replicate that exactly isn't without risk. So you really want to ask the right questions and give yourself time. Raw materials are going to vary between manufacturers. Water quality is going to vary. So even those small differences can really affect the specs of your formulation. You can hand your contract manufacturer your formula and get something different back that doesn't match. So Yes, ask very specific questions before you hand over a tech transfer. Have they done tech transfers before in the exact category that you're looking to do? What is the process they're going to use for raw material qualification? Are they going to bring in new raw materials to match to your spec exactly, or are they going to be substituting with raw materials that they may have in stock? What's going to happen if they produce the batch and it's not meeting the standards? How are they going to address that? And how are they going to handle that? And also make sure that you're agreeing on the standard. The standard should be your standard. You're going to want them to reproduce it in the lab, approve it against your standard, and then that's going to be the same standard that you're going to use for production. So I think it is more complex than people really realize.
And that's why I said, to me, tech transfer is a real test of the of the lab's capabilities. But we started talking a little earlier about communication. So let's carry on down that road. Communication and technical depth, from your CM team. Because these are two things that separate your partner from, just a vendor.
Just a vendor, yeah.
Yeah. And they're the hardest to evaluate before the relationship starts. What do you, Miriam, what do you look for here? And what signals tell you that the team that's sitting across from you is a team that you can actually grow with, or even if this is the team that you're going to be working directly with on your account?
On the communication side, I think what you see at the beginning is what you're going to get. If the manufacturer is slow to respond during those initial conversations, if they're slow to submit samples, I mean, I think that gives you an indication of what response time is going to look like during your entire project. So you want to make sure you have clear, transparent, regular communication. And as we alluded to before, you really want to know who's going to be managing the day-to-day of the project. Is there going to be a project manager that's going to be aligning with you regularly? Who is that person going to be? And what is the cadence of communication going to look like? And are you going to be able to reach them when you need to reach them? So for communication, I'm just looking for, is there a dedicated person that's going to be handling your business? Are they responsive? Is the communication clear? Are they being transparent about who is responsible for what? On the technical side, I think sometimes founders will bristle a bit when their contract manufacturer is pushing back on them, maybe saying that their launch date isn't feasible or that the packaging that they want to use may have issues with the formula. But I would really caution you to listen to those contract manufacturers. A contract manufacturer that just says yes to everything is after your business, right? They just want to bring you on board. But I've definitely seen contract manufacturers save brands from themselves more times than you would think, right? Like they'll tell you when the viscosity of your formula won't work for the packaging you want to use, or they'll tell you when your timeline isn't realistic. And I think that's really valuable. That's the valuable of an experienced partner, and really listen to that partner. They've been through it before.
Absolutely. Look, I mean, in the end, they're the expert in the manufacturing realm, right? And they're also the ones who know their machinery, you
They know
know?
their machinery, they know how to scale up. I mean, some founders really think if their contract manufacturer is pushing back on them, they're not the right partner. I look at it completely the opposite way. If what they're pushing back on is valid and they're giving you their technical expertise, it's a sign of a good partnership.
All right, so to finish off on this particular segment, so from everything you've seen across the spectrum of partners, what's the single most common selection mistake brands make? The one that if you could get every founder to avoid would
Yep.
prevent the largest share of the launches that you get called in to fix.
Yeah, there's a few, but if I had to pick the most common one, it's choosing a vendor based on price. You're sending
Huh,
out
yes,
RFPs and you're going
yes.
with the vendor that gives you the best price. And I'm not going to say price doesn't matter. Of course it matters, but I don't think it's the key indicator in choosing a contract manufacturing partner. Um, you could be going with the lowest quote for sure, but then you'll realize maybe they don't have a quality person, or you're not clear on your formula ownership, or you have to go back and do testing that they haven't done. And I will say that when I see founders that choose contract manufacturers based on the lowest price, there's often so much that happens later where they have to pay more that it just negated all the savings that they got from that contract
Yeah.
manufacturer anyway. So, price is a factor, But all the other factors that we talked about earlier are really key as well in making that decision.
If I'm seeing one contract manufacturer's price so far removed from everyone else's,
Yeah.
that's also gonna be a red flag for me. It's like, why?
Yeah,
That
it's a huge red flag. They probably don't have the same infrastructure, or what are they not including in the price? Maybe they're not including the same testing that the other contract manufacturers are including, or the regulatory services they're going to provide you, or the quality services that they're going to be providing to you. You're right. It's a huge red flag.
mm, mm. And look, I mean, I'm also still a big advocate for going to see the facility. Like if you're choosing, if it's come down to two, for example,
Mm,
to actually take the time to go walk their floor, to actually take the time to go and see them in person, see what their place actually looks like, and sometimes I'll even say, look, if you can't go yourself, find, if you have a regulatory team, if you have
mhm.
a, quality, you can hire people to do it for you. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
There are contractors who would be more than happy to do it and have the expertise to know what to look for.
It's a
So,
great question to ask if you can come and visit. If the answer is no, that's a red flag.
yeah.
It's great to get there, get the vibe of the people, see what the floor looks like. Is it clean? You'll see a lot of things right away that will let you know if it's the right partner for you. And if you really can't get there or you can't get somebody there, ask if you can speak to another customer and get
Mm,
some references. Yeah.
mm, mm. And that's another thing which to me is a red flag, but I get pushback about this all the time. And
Mhm.
that's when I ask the contract manufacturer, hey, I'd like to speak to one of your other, clients. I'd like to, get a recommendation from them or ask them questions about their relationship with you. And their answer is we don't divulge who else we.
Yeah, confidentiality. Yeah, you'll hear that a lot. But I find that there are definitely CMs that will give you that information because they have great partnerships and they're proud of the
Mhm.
work that they
Mhm.
accomplish.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Look, what I've found is that usually the ones who will say no, we have strict confidentiality, are usually the ones that don't tend to have repeat business. So
Yes,
they don't really want you talking to, you know what I mean, to the people they're doing
that's a
business
great
with.
point. Yeah.
But anyway, okay. So that's selection. Now I want to go to a question that's tied to selection, but it rarely gets asked at the same time, which is whether the partner you chose can actually grow with you. So now, Miriam, I want to get into scalability because not every CM can scale, and most founders just don't know what to ask about it up front. So I want to spend this segment on, scalability and, what people almost never talk about until they have to fix it. Things like, because it works in the lab, people don't realize it doesn't necessarily scale, right? Or that if you're able to do something at a small batch, like say you're able to make something at 5,000 units, sometimes that same formula, for whatever reason, breaks at 50,000, right? And founders rarely know what to ask until they've already experienced it or they're going through it. So let's just start at the top here, Miriam. So from your point of view, what are the early questions a founder should be asking about scalability before they learn the hard way?
I think you're looking for a contract manufacturer that's the right size for you and where you project you'll be in the next couple of years. So you want to make sure that the equipment that they have is actually sized for your volumes now, and where you're planning to go. So you have the best, the greatest efficiency. You want to know whether they've made the product before at scale that you're planning to make. If they've never made, a stick formula before and you're talking about scaling it up, maybe it's not the right partner for you. You don't want to be the guinea pig on that one. So find out about the sizes of their kettles, the sizing of their equipment, what typical batch sizes they can make, how large they can scale, and get an understanding of what their production scheduling looks like how far out are they booking. CMs usually give you a date, like after we receive raw materials and packaging, it's usually about 6 to 8 weeks. If they're really at capacity, a really busy vendor, that number will get longer and it might not work for you. Um, and you want to know about how their line trials and batch approvals work. Do they have kettle sizes that are going to work for line trial and batch approval up front? And always make sure you're incorporating your line trials and pilot batches into timelines. That's something we can get into too. But
Mm.
from a lab perspective, it's really different. You were talking about, what changes when a formula moves from the lab to a production batch. And you're right, a lab sample is made by a chemist working at a bench. They're working with really small quantities of raw materials. It's a very controlled environment, and there's a lot of hands-on attention. There's a chemist there the whole time. Production is a completely different environment. They're using larger vessels. There's different mixing equipment, different shear rates, different temperatures, and people can be surprised that a formula that you approved in the lab isn't coming out exactly the same way or behaving the same way when one of those variables changes in
Yeah.
production.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, listen, I mean, I get pushback about that all the time. I'll hear people tell me that makes no sense. You know what I'm saying?
I've heard
That I have a
contract
formula, I love
manufacturers,
my formula.
yeah,
They're not understanding. And it can also be things like, dude, your formula is too complicated. Do you know what I'm just saying? Like, you've got ingredients in here that are so rare or so difficult to find or so, you know what I mean, sensitive. I mean, you can carry on talking about that, but there are many, many reasons why a formula can't scale, even to 5,000 units once it's left the lab.
I get pushback on this too, sometimes from contract manufacturers and sometimes from chemists. But I've been doing this long enough that I do see a lot of things go wrong at scale up. I would say most commonly I see viscosity changes. So you've approved a body wash that works perfectly with your bottle and your pump, but after production from the floor, it's too thick or too thin. I've seen where the texture is different from what you've approved. I've definitely seen different colors. This is something you can see in powders or sort of colored body wash products where the color doesn't look the same as what you approved. Fragrance, absolutely. Fragrance can be an issue. And sometimes you'll see issues like separation happening after scale up. So, the cost of finding that out during a production run is really significant. And that's why a good contract manufacturer is going to recommend a pilot batch. And, as a founder, make sure you're asking up front about that. What is the scale up process going to look like? Are they going to be running a pilot batch as part of their process?
Mm,
Are they going to be running a line trial as part of that process? And, I do find founders waive those things because they do add cost. But the cost of
yeah.
finding out, down the road that you've got 20,000 pieces of an unusable product, I mean, you should have, it's less of a risk to do the pilot up front. So you really know what you're going to get. And a good contract manufacturer is going to have those
Mm.
worked in as part of their processes.
Yeah.
Um,
And I mean, just for those who are listening to this conversation about CMs for the very first time, just be aware that, these are part of the questions you need to actually be asking your CM when you're vetting who you want to choose. Because, to your point earlier, Miriam, if you're choosing someone just based on price, chances are these people don't run line trials or pilot trials. You
yeah,
know what I mean?
absolutely. Absolutely.
They chances are they don't do that. They don't even offer that. That's why it's cheaper. You can, what I mean, you can avoid all of this. But in the end, like you say, problems compound when it comes to manufacturing. If you skip something here, you may get away with it here, but you didn't know that those dominoes were going to start to fall.
Absolutely. You're going to pay for it eventually. So ask
Yeah.
before you sign on to a contract manufacturer if they do pilots and
Mhm.
line trials, and also ask what's going to happen if the pilot fails. What's going to happen next if the pilot shows issues? Understanding that upfront will really goes a long way in solving
Yeah,
problems down the
yeah.
road.
Because, when that pilot fails, chances are you're going back to the bench. You're going back to the bench to try to figure out why. And once you're back on the bench, chances are you're probably going to have to redo some testing because something in that formula is going to have to change. So,
Absolutely. And, to your point, if you're going back to the bench, that could change your ingredient listing. And what if you've
mhm,
already ordered your packaging with your ingredient listing on it?
yeah,
That packaging is unusable. So, I mean,
yeah,
that's why I really emphasize the timeline and doing everything in the right order. It just really saves you so much risk down the road.
So don't try to take the shortcuts. Don't I can't stress it enough. And I know that and we spoke about this right before we started, our interview here. This whole concept that, if you don't take these shortcuts, how are you going to make money? We're going to come to patterns and shortcuts in a bit, but the point I'm trying to get at here is, that mindset is what's going to get you into trouble.
Absolutely.
So I want to just go back here to tech transfers because, moving an existing formula to a new partner, as we'd been speaking about before, is maybe one of the hardest versions of the scale-up challenge. Beyond the R&D capability question we covered earlier, what makes a tech transfer at scale succeed or fail? And what's the founder supposed to do if the formula won't reproduce on their new partner's line?
Well, tech transfer at scale isn't about just whether they could reproduce the formula. Typically, the first thing you're going to see is a lab batch of your formula. So you know that your formula can be replicated in the lab. And you're right, it's a different story to scale that tech transfer consistently at production for every single order that you place. I would say, documentation is important. You need to ensure that you're giving the manufacturer the complete formula, raw materials, trade names, manufacturing process. If you can give them the raw material specs, the COA, the CFAs, so that they can make sure that they're matching all raw materials as closely as possible. So some of that onus is on you to make sure that you're giving the manufacturer all the documentation that you have on the formula and the manufacturing procedure, right? Because if they're starting with the wrong recipe, yeah, you're not going to get the right formula at the end.
Mhm.
And then, even if you get a lab sample and it's looking good, you're still going to want to go to pilot batch. Even if the formula seems simple, I would still go ahead and do a pilot batch. So you can call out immediately if the product looks or feels different from your approved standard.
Mm.
Again, that's going to save you time and hassle down the road. If you're going into production and you're working with a good contract manufacturing partner and something is off in the pilot batch, I wouldn't panic right away. I would if you're working with a good manufacturer, give them the chance to try to fix it and figure out what's going on. If it doesn't seem solvable, they'll have processes in place like looking at each raw material side by side to try to make sure that it matches and check everything sort of back against that original documentation. So don't panic. Give them a chance to work out the technical aspects of it. Yeah, and go from there. But make sure you're doing that pilot.
And then, talking of pilots and line trials, one of the other things I get asked about all the time, because the pushback is we don't want to do it because it's a waste of money, right? We're going to have
Mhm.
you're doing a line trial and I can't sell these goods. So I've got, the X amount of unsellable goods. There are, things you can actually do. You know what I mean? You may not be able to put a price tag on them and sell them, but there are things that you can do. I don't know if you want to talk to that about line trials.
Well, you can end up with some sellable goods from a line trial. And I've seen very often brands use those samples for their PR samples.
Hmm.
So they have something before launch, they use them for photography samples, they use them to give out to influencers. So, it's not necessarily a sunk cost. Be creative about what you're going to do with those goods. Obviously, if the line trial fails or the pilot fails, you have unusable goods. But think about the cost of that if you had run that straight to production, where you would have been. I mean, it's insane to me to waive that pilot.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. But you know what? It is important that people hear us talk about this, because these are decisions that they need to make. And part of their decision is explaining to their investor, where the money's going.
Yeah, that's a
So,
great point.
you have to be able to justify and defend the spend, right?
Yeah,
And this to me is something that is defensible, the pilot and line trial. Um,
absolutely. The risk in not doing it is just so great.
oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Okay, so here's an even harder version of the scalability question. Sometimes a brand simply outgrows their CM, right? The CM was right for them at say
Yeah.
5,000 units, but is totally wrong for them at 50,000 units a month. So, how do you know when you've reached that point? And can you transition without breaking your business?
Yeah, you can. I mean, sometimes it seems like a scary thing to do to have that conversation with your manufacturer, but the earlier you have it, the better. How do you know when you've outgrown them? I think there's some early indications. You'll see maybe your lead times start getting longer. Maybe you have trouble getting them on the phone. Maybe they can't keep up with your volumes. And that's really sort of the time to have a conversation with them about what's going on. And also a bit of a flag that you need to have all your information ready to travel. Always have your information ready to travel with you. So if you own your formula and you're really clear on your IP, make sure you already have your formula documentation, your safety data, your manufacturing instructions, your stability and compatibility data, your HRIPT results. Have all that on hand so that you can start vetting new partners really early if you need to. You don't want to be in a position where uh, the relationship's broken with your existing CM and now you have nowhere to go. So, sort out your formula IP. If you own it, you're free to take it with you. You own that formula. Just make sure it's in your contract. Um, but keep the lines of communication open. There'll be those signs, but again, make sure you're prepared. Make sure you've started talking to some new partners, really early in the process, and you know where you're going to go.
Mm. And the other thing for me is suppliers. You know what I mean? There seems to be this misconception that the only people who have a supplier relationship is your CM. No, you need a supplier relationship. You need a relationship with your suppliers because to me, it's part of redundancy, right? If you don't have redundancy, it's very, very difficult to scale. It's very difficult to transfer. You know what I mean? So, you know, yes, your CM should be qualifying all of the raw material suppliers. But all of that documentation, you should be able to speak to the supplier. It's your raw material, you know.
Yeah,
And
and don't wait till the relationship breaks to start gathering all of this documentation. Because if you're already in an uncomfortable conversation with your CM, right, and things are getting prickly, that's not the time you want to start asking for
no,
documentation. You want to have it right when it's available.
yeah, exactly, exactly. Do everything up front when everything is rosy and good.
I know,
Before,
and a lot of founders don't think about it. You sort of
no,
don't think about asking for these
no,
things until the
no,
relationship starts to crack.
no.
But by then, it can be late. It can be too late.
Yeah. Now, look, I mean, I think maybe that's human nature. You know what I mean? We take things for granted until things start falling apart.
But you don't want to be, starting over with somebody or in and out of stock position because you didn't get the details up front.
Okay, so we've covered the partner you choose and whether that partner can scale with you. Now let's go to what happens once the relationship is in motion. Because most CM relationships that fail don't fail at the start, right? When everything's rosy. They fail in the middle, in production, when the formula is approved, when the packaging is selected, and everybody's busy getting ready for the launch, right?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden something's gone wrong and nobody seems to be able to name what that something is, or everybody's pointing fingers at everybody else and everything starts to break. So, Miriam, this is usually where you come in, right? Where things are starting to fall apart. The warning signs are there, but what are those warning signs from your point of view? That the CM partnership is starting to break, and we touched a little on it before. This is the point where you get called in because things have stalled, things are delayed, things are broken. And what actually happens? Do people call you and say to you, "Hey, Miriam, something's going on, something's not right," and they can't quite articulate it? Like,
Mhm.
what happens when people call you?
Well, let's assume that you've done their due diligence and they're working with a great CM, right? They've got a great partnership, they've vetted the supplier, and they're working with someone who is technically competent. Okay. And this may be a bit controversial, but when something gets stuck, in my experience, a lot of times it's the brand that's actually responsible for more of getting stuck than they actually realize. So they think it's all the fault of the CM, but I think there's some things that you need to look at internally. And the first thing is coming back to decisions that we sort of talked about at the beginning of the conversation. What I find often when I'm sort of dissecting a timeline or what's happened in a stuck launch is that the brand is usually still making decisions that should have been locked weeks or months earlier. The packaging is still changing. They still want to add hero ingredients to their formula. Um, they haven't sort of locked these decisions in, and they still want changes. And that makes the relationship with the manufacturer
Mm,
really tough. And every
mm.
one of those changes has a downstream cost. It resets stability, it resets compatibility, it can move your production spot, right? At some point, your manufacturer is going to say, your testing isn't done. You haven't made these decisions. I'm going to have to move out your production. Another one that I see a lot is communication breakdown because, we talked about having regular touch bases and being able to reach the project manager at the contract manufacturer. But a lot of times I see brands just sort of handing everything off to the CM. You've got to be really involved in that process. You've got to be reviewing the critical path timeline with them on a regular basis. You've got to be locking in decisions. You're talking about the dominoes. We need to keep those dominoes up. We need to be making those decisions on time. And if we're not, a lot of problems are going to surface when production's supposed to be taking place because the communication's broken down or because you haven't made the right decisions. And another one I see that causes a lot of delays is gaps in the brand providing specific documentation or artwork to the CM. Sometimes the CM is waiting. They're waiting for the brand to approve the packaging specs. They're waiting for a sign off on artwork. The CM is ready and the brand is the bottleneck. So I think it's really important to sort of look at your piece in the breakdown. There's definitely, problems that come from the contract manufacturer. If they're really vague about timelines, that they're not giving you answers, they're not responding, you can't get them on the phone. Those are issues. But I'd always really start with looking internally and see what you could be doing differently.
Talking of bottlenecks, one of the big bottlenecks that I've seen, from the brand side, is artwork,
Yeah,
labels, right?
artwork. Yeah.
Because those things have to be approved, and that takes time to do these regulatory approvals. It takes time. Brands seem to be under the impression that, I gave it to you yesterday. I need it back today.
Well,
No.
that's what I hear so commonly from my friends in regulatory. Yes, a brand thinks they've been working on their artwork for weeks. They turn it over to a third party regulatory consultant, and they're expecting it back in 24 to 48 hours. That regulatory consultant, they're assuming a large responsibility here. You've given them a big job. They're going to need to request a lot of documentation to double check that all that artwork is correct, to
Mhm.
validate all of your claims, to make
Yeah.
sure that your inky is right. Yeah, it's going to take time. So
Yeah.
that's the importance of really building out a great critical path timeline from the beginning, and really understanding what can happen consecutively and what can happen concurrently, and making sure that you're meeting your internal deadlines.
And actually it can take months sometimes to get what you're missing.
If you
Because
don't have your documentation
yeah,
prepared, absolutely.
because believe it or not, yeah, just because this is an emergency to you, it doesn't mean it's an emergency to the supplier. You know what I'm saying? The
Yeah,
supplier has, a whole queue ahead of you. You
sure. And
just,
if you're not ready to go, you
yeah,
go
yeah,
to the
yeah.
end of the queue.
Talking of timeline slippage, the one thing everybody loves to bitch about because you
Yep.
can always find something when it comes to timeline slippage. Every launch I've ever seen has had some. I
Yep.
have never, ever, ever seen a launch happen without some kind of, delay or some kind of timeline slip. What is the difference between normal slippage, right? The usual, and the signals when something is seriously wrong. Because I want the founders in the audience to understand and be able to recognize the difference.
I think you need to look internally first and know, as you said, every launch is going to have some timeline slippage. And the biggest issue I see is brands not building that slippage into their own timeline. So when they look at their timeline, it looks like they're going to be able to launch in July. But if an expert looked at your timeline, they're going to say, no, this is an October launch. As I said, you can't have every step of your timeline happening the day that the step before it ended. You got to leave a little bit of time in between each step to bring in raw materials, to have time to prepare a batch, to have time to have a regulatory expert look at your artwork. And in addition to that, I would even throw in more buffers, knowing that, a raw material scheduled to come in maybe a week late. When your packaging is scheduled to land, you may get stuck in customs. That could take 2 weeks or even longer if your documentation isn't in order. So make sure all of your known risks are incorporated into your timeline. And if you've got a great solid timeline with buffers, that will cover the normal slippage that's going to happen. If something's seriously wrong, you may get indications from your contract manager. You won't be able to reach them on the phone. There'll be a lack of transparency. When you're asking for status updates, you'll get very vague answers. But don't ask vague questions. If you ask your contract manufacturer, for a status update, you're probably not going to get something really clear. I think the first step, if you sense that something is wrong, is go back and ask all your vendors for an updated production schedule. I want an updated production schedule with dates for every remaining step. So start there and see if there's a problem. And then, delve back into the timeline and see, is the slippage because a decision on your side wasn't made on time? Is the slippage because there's an issue with your contract manufacturer? You really have to define sort of where the slippage is coming from in order to address it.
Finally, while we just round up the segment, when you finally realized that this relationship is in some serious trouble, you're in dire straits here, how do you know when it can be fixed or when you need to walk away? Because both decisions can be expensive. It's just that the costs are different.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it depends on the type of pushback you're getting. If it's, again, sort of back to this vagueness, if it's vague, we're working on it. Um, or, you're sort of not getting reasons for why there's an issue, you may start to think like maybe they don't have the technical depth to solve this problem. And that's sort of when you may want to look at leaving. But if it's technical pushback with a valid reason, we can't make that change because that's going to reset stability and push us off our timeline. And this is sort of when I come back to a contract manufacturer that's going to save you from yourself. If it's legitimate pushback, I would take the time to really explore it and see if it's valuable feedback.
All right, so let's talk now about investors, or let's talk to investors. So for those investors in the audience, when you're looking at a beauty brand in diligence, okay, so Miriam, you're going to be the investor now. Put your investor hat on.
Okay.
The manufacturing relationship is one of the highest leverage signals you can read, and the one that's actually the hardest to kind of recognize from the outside. So, what are the questions you should be asking as an investor? What should you be asking the brand about their relationship with their manufacturer?
Well, investor diligence isn't my world, but I'll try to put my investor hat on a little bit. There's signals that that a brand is well built and in a good state. And not to sound like a broken record, but the first thing you want to know is whether the brand owns their formula, right? Because that's going to have really enormous implications about the value of the business. So if the brand is built on a stock formula, from a contract manufacturer, you're tied in only to that contract manufacturer. So if there's issues for scaling or the relationship breaks down, that can have serious implications for where the brand's going to go next. So who owns the IP? The second thing, you really want to make sure that there's a solid quality agreement between the brand and the CM. You probably want to take a look at it, make sure that it's quite robust and detailed, and that every critical function is assigned to somebody, whether it's the brand or whether it's the CM or whether it's a third party, and make sure that all the parties knew what they were doing when they built this relationship. Third, you're probably going to make sure the documentation is in order. Is the stability data done? Has preservative challenge testing been done? Has there been HRIPT testing? That whole substantiation file, safety substantiation file has to be put together because we know that under MOCRA that the brand owner is the responsible party and all that documentation needs to be pulled together and you need to make sure it exists.
I couldn't agree with you more on all three of those points. So well done with your investor hat on. All right, so coming back to the good, the bad, and the ugly, and we touched a bit on it in the very beginning, and I said I would come back to it. What is the good that scales well, and what is the ugly that's going to end a brand?
I'm still going to stand by clarity being the good that scales. I think, the clarity in writing about who's responsible for what is really going to help that brand scale successfully and sort of avoid disasters and help the relationship with the contract manufacturer grow and to stay in order. When you have a good, transparent relationship with your contract manufacturer, you have a greater chance that you're going to scale. And that when your contract manufacturer pushes back on you about something, that you're going to listen to them. So I think having clarity and transparency is really key. And the ugly that can end a brand is really just that ambiguity, not knowing who owns your formula IP, not having testing done because you didn't know it was your responsibility to do it, not being able to get your documentation. If a relationship breaks down, you need to have that up front. Those things that you're not thinking about, like how you said before, Mallory, like the things you're not thinking about when things are seem smooth, when the road seems smooth, are going to come back to bite you later. So, I mean, from my perspective, I'm always really wary of a founder that just focuses on speed, moving fast without making clear decisions early enough, skipping testing because you've got a retail date locked. Those are things that can really just get a brand to hit a wall and destroy their reputation.
This is specifically for founders working with a CM, right? Right now, today, you're in a relationship with a CM. What is the one thing you can do this week? Not this year or this quarter, this week, right? To make sure that you're on solid ground with your relationship.
I mean, yeah, the one thing I would tell you to do right away is pull out your quality agreement with your contract manufacturer and read it and get familiar with it. Make sure you have that formula ownership if that's something that's important to you. Understand what testing you're responsible for. And if you have problem with your contract manufacturer, don't panic. That's something that I see brands do a lot is, as soon as there's a problem, they panic and make a rash decision. And the first thing I would say is, get really clear on what the problem is. Is it a communication problem, a capacity problem, a technical problem? And just have a direct conversation with your contract manufacturer. Don't be
Yeah.
afraid to just really tell them what's not working and give them a chance to fix it, because you'd be surprised how often just that clear communication can help solve that problem. So, I think sort of that's what I would say. If things aren't clearing up and not improving within 3 months, then you can start sort of planning a transition. But always give your contract manufacturer a chance to remedy something that's not running smoothly.
Okay,
Yeah,
perfect.
yeah.
Perfect. In closing, guys, here's what I want you to take from this. The CM relationship is one of the most consequential things you'll ever build, and often one of the most difficult to navigate. You don't choose it once. You choose it, you scale with it, you read the warning signs when something starts to drift, as you heard us talking about, and sometimes you have to walk away from it. The brands that hold up at scale treat that relationship as the central, ongoing operational relationship of the build, not a vendor agreement you sign and forget about. The brands that don't end up calling Miriam. And by the time they do, the problem usually isn't what they think it is. Miriam, thank you so much for being here. This was a great conversation, and I know that we spoke about a lot, but this was the operator's view, your point of view that I wanted to put on record. I couldn't be happier that I got to do this with you. So, to everyone watching and listening, as always, if you found this conversation valuable, please like, share, and subscribe to Pretty Equity on YouTube and Spotify. And the interview series is also now available on Substack if you want to catch this one or some past interviews in written form. And of course, you can always follow me and Miriam on LinkedIn for more expert insights, can't speak, on the issues that drive smarter beauty investment. I'm Melory Johnson. Thank you for watching and listening, and I will see you all next time.